In 1975, a Texas auto mechanic walked into a recording studio, still wearing his work uniform covered in grease stains. Within hours, he'd record a song that would change country music forever. That mechanic was Gene Watson, a man whose voice would later be called pure country gold by George Jones himself. But despite releasing 34 albums and charting 72 Billboard hits, Watson's name has largely faded from the spotlight. Today, we're uncovering what really happened to the man they called the singer's singer, from his meteoric rise to the personal battles that nearly silenced one of country music's most powerful voices. And stick around, because we'll reveal how a shocking diagnosis in the 2000s led to one of the most unexpected comebacks in country music history. The year was 1943. In the small town of Palestine, Texas, a family welcomed their sixth child, Gene Watson. Growing up in poverty, young Gene spent his early years living in a converted school bus, traveling between Texas and Arkansas as his father searched for work. But it was inside that cramped bus where Watson first discovered his voice, singing gospel songs with his family to pass the long hours on the road. Life was far from easy for the Watson family. Their converted school bus didn't just serve as transportation, it was their home, kitchen, and music room all rolled into one. Gene's father, a former crop duster turned sawmill worker, taught his children that if they wanted something in life, they had to work for it. This lesson would shape Watson's entire career approach. By age 12, Watson was already performing in local honky-tonks, standing on Coca-Cola crates to reach the microphone. The owners would let him sing, but made him wait outside between sets. He was too young to legally be in the establishments. These early performances taught him how to read a crowd, how to hold their attention, and most importantly, how to sing through the noise of a rowdy bar crowd. But dreams don't pay the bills. For nearly 2 decades, Watson split his time between turning wrenches under car hoods and turning heads with his voice in smoke-filled bars across Texas. Every dollar he earned from mechanic work went straight into funding his music career. He'd work on cars all day, clean up as best he could, and head straight to whatever club would let him perform. Some nights, he'd drive hundreds of miles just for a chance to sing for a few hours. While other aspiring singers were chasing fame in Nashville, Watson was building a different kind of foundation. Night after night, he refined his craft in small venues, developing a signature style that blended traditional honky-tonk with heart-wrenching ballads. His reputation grew slowly but steadily across the Texas club circuit, earning him the nickname the Houston Honky-Tonk Master among local music fans. Club owners started to notice that whenever Watson was on the bill, their bars would fill up with people who came specifically to hear him sing. The breakthrough finally came in 1975. Capitol Records took a chance on the unknown mechanic, releasing Love in the Hot Afternoon, a song that would climb to number 3 on the Billboard country charts. But here's what few people know. Watson recorded that career-defining hit during his lunch break, still wearing his mechanic's uniform. He simply couldn't afford to take time off work. The session musicians in the studio that day later recalled how Watson nailed the song in just 2 takes, then rushed back to finish an oil change he'd left pending. It was this same blue-collar authenticity that would become both Watson's greatest strength and eventually one of his biggest challenges in an increasingly commercialized industry. In an era where many country singers were starting to adopt more polished, pop-influenced sounds, Watson remained steadfastly traditional. His voice, pure, powerful, and emotionally charged, stood out precisely because it hadn't been smoothed over by vocal coaches or commercial considerations. He sang like a man who had lived every word of his songs, because in many cases he had. Remember that shocking diagnosis I mentioned earlier? Well, it turns out Watson's biggest battle wouldn't be in the recording studio, but we'll get to that. First, let's see how a mechanic with no formal music training managed to outsell some of Nashville's biggest names throughout the late 1970s, and why the industry would soon try to change everything about him. By 1976, Gene Watson was Nashville's most unlikely success story. Music executives who'd previously ignored the Texas mechanic were now scrambling to understand his appeal. What they found was simple. In a time when country music was starting to polish its rough edges, Watson's voice cut through the noise with raw, emotional authenticity. His string of hits began flowing like oil from a Texas well. Where Love Begins shot up the charts, followed by Paper Rosie, a heart-wrenching ballad about a homeless woman that showcased Watson's ability to turn a story into an emotional experience. But it was Farewell Party that would become his signature song, a haunting tale of lost love that would earn him standing ovations for decades to come. The song's success was particularly sweet for Watson. He discovered it on a small independent label and fought for the right to record it when his producers initially dismissed it as too dark. What set Watson apart wasn't just his voice, it was his song selection. While many artists were chasing radio-friendly hooks, he was choosing songs that told complex, adult stories. Should I Come Home or Should I Go Crazy explored the moral dilemma of a married man tempted by infidelity. Nothing Sure Looked Good on You painted a vivid picture of love at first sight in a small-town diner. These weren't just songs, they were 3-minute movies that played out in listeners' minds. In the recording studio, Watson was developing a reputation that would follow him throughout his career. Unlike many stars who needed multiple takes and technical assistance, Watson would typically nail his vocals in 1 or 2 takes. Studio musicians from that era still talk about his uncanny ability to deliver perfectly pitched, emotionally resonant performances without any warm-up. His former producer once revealed that they often kept Watson's scratch vocals, the preliminary recordings meant to guide the band, because they were too perfect to improve upon. The industry took notice. Between 1975 and 1983, Watson placed over 20 singles in the Billboard Country Top 20. Fellow artists began to call him the Singer's Singer, a title earned because even Nashville's top vocalists would stand in the wings during his shows studying his technique. Merle Haggard once remarked that Watson could sing the phone book and make it sound like a chart topper. George Jones, notoriously selective with his praise, declared Watson one of the greatest voices country music had ever produced. But Watson's success came with an unusual caveat. He never moved to Nashville. Unlike virtually every other country star of his era, he kept his home in Texas, flying in only when necessary for recordings or appearances. This decision allowed him to maintain his authenticity, but would later prove costly as the industry began to change. When important deals were being made in Nashville's back rooms and golf courses, Watson was often back in Texas, keeping his connections to the local music scene that had given him his start. Behind the scenes, Watson was pioneering another aspect of country music that few recognize today. He was one of the first artists to create what we now call the traditional country sound, a perfect balance between honky-tonk's emotional rawness and Nashville's polished production. His records became the blueprint for how country music could sound professional without losing its soul. The way he'd work with steel guitars and fiddles, insisting they complement rather than overwhelm his vocals, created a template that countless artists would follow. By 1980, Gene Watson had achieved what seemed impossible, becoming a country music superstar while staying true to his roots. His concerts were selling out across the country, his albums were going gold, and his influence on the genre was undeniable. Even pop critics who typically ignored country music were taking notice, with Rolling Stone magazine calling him country music's best-kept secret. His live shows had become legendary, with fans driving hundreds of miles to hear him perform. What made these shows special wasn't just Watson's voice. It was his ability to make every person in the audience feel like he was singing directly to them. But as the 1980s progressed, storm clouds were gathering over Music Row. A new sound was emerging, one that would challenge everything Gene Watson stood for. The industry that had embraced his traditional style was about to undergo a dramatic transformation, and the singer's singer would soon face the toughest decision of his career. Rehook, that life-changing diagnosis we mentioned, it would come right when Watson thought he'd weathered the worst of the industry's changes. But before we get there, let's look at how the rise of urban cowboy country music nearly derailed one of the genre's most authentic voices, and how Watson's refusal to change his style would cost him more than just chart positions. The year was 1980, and country music was about to change forever. John Travolta had just strutted across the silver screen in Urban Cowboy, triggering a nationwide fascination with mechanical bulls and rhinestone-studded shirts. Suddenly, country music wasn't just for rural America anymore. It was becoming a mainstream phenomenon, and the industry was eager to capitalize on this new urban audience. Record labels began pouring unprecedented amounts of money into country music production. Studio budgets swelled, allowing for elaborate string sections, electronic instruments, and the kind of polished production previously reserved for pop records. This wasn't just a change in sound, it was a fundamental shift in how country music was being marketed, produced, and consumed. Honky-tonks were being replaced by upscale country nightclubs, and the music had to match this new environment. For Gene Watson, this cultural shift presented a stark choice. Record executives began pushing him to adopt a more polished sound, suggesting he add synthesizers and drum machines to his traditional arrangements. They wanted him to trade his honky-tonk roots for what they called crossover appeal. But Watson, who'd spent decades perfecting his craft in Texas dance halls, saw things differently. He understood that the industry wasn't just asking him to change his sound, they were asking him to change who he was. One particular meeting with his label heads in early 1981 illustrated the growing divide. When presented with a selection of pop country songs chosen for his next album, Watson responded by pulling out a worn cassette tape of demos he'd collected from traditional country songwriters. The label executives listened politely, then explained that such songs, while technically excellent, weren't what radio stations were looking for anymore. The pressure mounted with each new release. While artists like Kenny Rogers and Eddie Rabbitt were topping both country and pop charts with their crossover hits, Watson's traditionally styled singles were finding it harder to break into the top 10. Radio programmers, once eager to play anything he released, began suggesting his sound was too country for their evolving formats. The irony wasn't lost on Watson. Being too country for country radio was like being too Italian for Italy. Behind the scenes, the tension was taking its toll. Studio sessions became battlegrounds between Watson's artistic integrity and commercial demands. During one particularly heated recording session in 1982, Watson famously walked out after producers tried to add synthetic strings to one of his ballads. He later explained, "You can't put a tuxedo on a honky-tonk song and expect it to dance the same way." The economic realities of this new era hit hard. Tours that had once played to packed houses now faced increasing competition from urban cowboy-themed nightclubs featuring mechanical bulls and DJs spinning the latest crossover hits. Watson's band, one of the tightest traditional country outfits in the business, watched as venues began requesting they incorporate more pop elements into their show. But Watson wasn't just fighting against change, he was fighting for something. Every time he stepped on stage, he saw audiences connecting with his music in a way that transcended trends. His live shows remained packed, even as his radio presence diminished. The same authenticity that had made him a star was now being labeled as outdated. Yet his fans understood something that Music Row had forgotten. Real country music wasn't about following trends. It was about telling truth through song. The mid-1980s brought a parade of missed opportunities. Major labels passed on songs that Watson had earmarked for recording, only to see them become hits for more commercially viable artists. His 1984 album, Little by Little, marked a turning point. It contained some of his finest vocal performances to date, but struggled to find airplay in an increasingly crowded marketplace. Watson's touring schedule during this period revealed his dedication to his craft. While many of his contemporaries were playing urban venues with elaborate stage shows, he maintained a grueling schedule of performances in smaller markets, often doing 2 shows a night. These shows became a haven for fans of traditional country music who would travel hundreds of miles to hear the kind of country music that was vanishing from radio. Yet even as the mainstream industry began to turn its back on traditional country, Watson was unknowingly building a legacy that would outlast the urban cowboy trend. His unwavering commitment to authentic country music was inspiring a new generation of artists who'd grown tired of the synthesized sounds dominating radio. In small clubs across Texas, young singers were studying Watson's records, learning that success didn't have to mean sacrifice of style. By 1985, the country music landscape had changed dramatically. The urban cowboy boom was fading, but it had permanently altered the industry's approach to marketing and producing country music. Many traditional artists found themselves without record deals, victims of an industry that had grown increasingly focused on crossover potential. Watson managed to keep recording, but his relationship with the major labels had become strained. Instead of following the crowd, Watson doubled down on his traditional sound. He began working with smaller independent labels that allowed him more artistic freedom. While this meant smaller budgets and less promotion, it also meant he could make the music he believed in. He told an interviewer at the time, "I'd rather play for 100 people who love real country music than 10,000 who don't know what they're listening to." As the 1980s drew to a close, Watson thought he'd weathered the worst of the industry's changes. But that serious health diagnosis we mentioned earlier, it was about to blindside him just as he was finding his footing in this new musical landscape. And the way he handled it would reveal more about his character than any song he'd ever sung. While Gene Watson was fighting to preserve traditional country music on stage, he was waging a much more personal battle behind the scenes. The constant touring, late nights, and stress of maintaining his career in a changing industry were taking their toll. By the early 1990s, the man known for his crystal-clear voice was struggling just to make it through a show. Few fans knew that Watson had been battling severe stomach issues since the mid-1980s. The condition, exacerbated by years of irregular meals and road life, had become so severe that he often performed while in excruciating pain. Yet night after night, he'd step onto stage, never letting the audience see his struggle. His band members from this era recall how he'd often retreat to the bus immediately after shows, exhausted from the effort of maintaining his powerful vocal delivery despite his physical discomfort. The music industry's shift toward younger artists in the 1990s added another layer of stress. While George Strait and Randy Travis had helped bring traditional country back to radio, the pendulum was swinging again. A new wave of artists like Garth Brooks and Billy Ray Cyrus were revolutionizing country music with high-energy shows and rock-influenced sounds. Watson found himself competing not just with changing musical tastes, but with the sheer spectacle of modern country entertainment. Then came the diagnosis that would change everything. In 2000, during what he thought would be a routine medical checkup, Watson received devastating news. Doctors had discovered cancer. The timing couldn't have been worse. He was in the middle of recording a new album and had dozens of tour dates booked. The doctors advised him to cancel everything, but Watson had other ideas. In a decision that would astound his medical team, Watson chose to continue performing while undergoing treatment. He'd schedule his treatments around his tour dates, often performing just days after a session. His reasoning was simple but profound. The music, he said, was the best medicine I could ask for. Fans who attended his shows during this period had no idea that the man delivering those powerful vocals was fighting for his life. During one particularly memorable show in 2001, Watson nearly collapsed backstage after a performance. His band wanted to cancel the second show of the evening, but Watson refused. He took a brief rest, then walked back out and delivered another full set. A recording from that night reveals no hint of his condition. His voice remained as strong and pure as ever. The physical challenges weren't Watson's only concerns. The financial reality of being a traditional country artist in the modern era meant he couldn't afford to take time off. Unlike many mainstream stars with massive record deals and touring revenues, Watson was essentially living show to show. His medical bills were mounting, but he kept this private, never wanting to be seen as seeking sympathy. His band members from this era tell stories that paint a picture of remarkable resilience. They recall Watson studying his medical documents on the bus between shows, scheduling treatments in whatever cities they were playing, and never once complaining about his situation. When asked how he maintained such a rigorous schedule while fighting cancer, Watson would simply say, "I've got people counting on me to show up and sing." The experience changed Watson's perspective on his career. While he'd always been grateful for his success, his brush with mortality gave him a deeper appreciation for every opportunity to perform. He began introducing more gospel songs into his shows, sharing brief glimpses of his spiritual side with audiences. His interpretation of classic country songs took on new depth, informed by his own struggles with mortality. By 2003, Watson had beaten cancer, but the victory came with a price. Years of touring and performing through illness had left him with chronic health issues that would require ongoing management. Yet somehow his voice remained unchanged, a fact that medical professionals found hard to explain. As one doctor put it, his vocal cords seemed to have been preserved by some kind of musical miracle. Watson had survived the industry changes of the 80s and beaten cancer in the early 2000s, but his greatest professional triumph was still to come. Just when everyone thought Gene Watson's story was winding down, Nashville would finally give him the recognition he'd earned decades ago. And the circumstances behind this long-overdue honor would prove that sometimes the best stories in country music are about redemption. 2005 marked a turning point in country music. As the genre drifted further from its roots, a counter-movement was brewing. A new generation of fans, tired of overproduced pop country, began seeking out authentic traditional country music. And there was Gene Watson, exactly where he'd always been, still delivering the pure country sound they were craving. The resurgence started quietly. Music critics reviewing Watson's 2005 album, Then and Now, seemed surprised to discover his voice hadn't aged a day. Videos of his performances began circulating online, introducing him to younger audiences who'd never heard real country music sung with such power and precision. Comment sections filled with variations of the same message. Why aren't they making country music like this anymore? What these new fans didn't know was that Watson had never stopped working. Through the lean years of the 1990s and his health battles in the early 2000s, he'd maintained a touring schedule that would exhaust performers half his age. Every weekend, his bus would roll into another small town, another county fair, another dance hall. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was preserving a musical tradition one show at a time. The digital age brought unexpected vindication. Streaming platforms meant new listeners could discover Watson's entire catalog, not just his radio hits. His version of Farewell Party began appearing on viral country music playlists alongside modern artists. Young singers on talent shows started covering his songs, often citing him as an influence despite never having heard him on mainstream radio. But the most significant recognition was still to come. In February 2020, after more than 50 years in country music, Gene Watson was finally invited to become a member of the Grand Ole Opry. The invitation came from Vince Gill, himself a guardian of traditional country music, who told the audience, "This is how country music should be sung." Watson, normally composed on stage, was visibly moved. His acceptance speech was simple but powerful. "I don't even know if I can talk. I'm not sure I have enough voice left after that one song." The timing of this honor proved particularly meaningful. Just weeks after his Opry induction, the world would change dramatically as venues shut down due to global circumstances. But Watson had already secured his place in country music history. The man who'd never compromised his musical principles, who'd survived industry changes and health challenges, who'd kept traditional country music alive through decades of change, was finally standing in country music's most hallowed circle. Today, Gene Watson continues to record and perform, carrying the torch for traditional country music into its next chapter. But before we wrap up this remarkable story, let's look at the lasting impact this former auto mechanic has had on country music and why his influence reaches far beyond his chart success. In 2024, at 80 years old, Gene Watson still stands at the microphone, hitting notes that singers half his age can't reach. His voice, somehow untouched by time, continues to remind audiences what country music is supposed to sound like. But his true legacy isn't just in the notes he's sung, it's in the path he's carved for others to follow. When modern country stars like Chris Stapleton and Tyler Childers talk about keeping traditional country music alive, they're following a trail that Watson helped blaze. His unwavering commitment to authentic country music through the urban cowboy era proved that staying true to your artistic vision isn't just admirable, it's sustainable. Every independent artist who chooses artistic integrity over commercial compromise owes a debt to pioneers like Watson who proved it could be done. His influence extends beyond just the music. Watson's approach to his career, maintaining his own business affairs, choosing artistic freedom over major label deals, and keeping his connection to his roots created a blueprint for independence in country music. Today's artists, armed with digital distribution and social media, are essentially following Watson's DIY ethic with modern tools. The story of Gene Watson is more than just a tale of survival in the music industry. It's a testament to the enduring power of authenticity. While his contemporaries changed their sound to chase trends, Watson changed the industry's perspective on what traditional country music could be. His voice didn't just preserve the past, it helped shape the future. From the converted school bus where he learned to sing, to the grand old Opry stage where his legacy was cemented, Gene Watson's journey represents everything great country music should be: authentic, resilient, and true to its roots. While the industry around him changed, his voice remained constant, reminding us that some things in country music don't need updating, just preserving.